This is Professor Stephen Shwiff of the Columbia Gorge Community College discussing the colonial families in the north and south of the British colonies. Now there is a significant difference between the two. In the north, and we're discussing here New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Pennsylvania, Maine, New York, New Jersey, all the colonies that were north of the Chesapeake. You mainly have areas that families settled in all together. And of course we've seen the primary examples of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. These groups were transporting not just families, but communities. And usually whole groups of town people would come together with their minister in tow, and they would form their own new town in the New World. And it would be just that, a replica of the old town that they had come from. And these communities were often based on religious ideas, as we've seen, and the idea that away from the English monarch, away from the Church of England, perfect societies, utopian societies, fulfilling God's wishes could be created. In the South, you had a much more mercantile drive. Men, and it was mostly men, for at least the first 15 years, came in, were interested in getting land to grow tobacco and to make their fortunes. And a lot of the men who came to Virginia and the South were mainly interested in making as much money as possible. Some may not have planned on staying, although it seems that most of the settlers did end up staying. Getting land, developing their livelihood. Now the groups that came over after the original settlers were mainly indentured servants, and these numbers are well over 70%. Depending on the timing, it could be as high as 90%. And these were both men and women. And the way indentured servitude worked, you can get more details on the lecture about Virginia, the colony of Virginia, is that a person would go to a ship captain, say, I need voyage to the New World, and I will work my voyage off over a period of years, usually 4 to 7 years. And the captain would say, sure, come aboard, sign this contract, you're now indentured to me. Once the ship arrived at its destination, those contracts were sold off to wealthier landowners, and these servants would work. Now, it wasn't always landing in the South. There were indentured servants in the North as well, but for the most part, the need for labor was in the South, in the tobacco fields of Virginia and Maryland, in the rice and indigo fields of South Carolina, in the farms of North Carolina and Georgia. By the 1750s had converted to a plantation type system very similar to the rest of the South. So these men and women were put to work. Men and women worked very hard labor. Now this is also where the slaves were brought in, and by the later 1600s, early 1700s, slave labor had taken most of the work that was assigned to indentured servants up to that time, and indentured servants stopped coming in general and especially to the South. So these groups in the South were more concerned about growing their states, but of course family desires would intervene and would start to develop. So let's start in the North with Massachusetts. The Puritan idea was that everyone in society had a role. And often my students will ask me, well, were women generally unhappy? Were they unhappy that they had to give up their rights under coverture? Were they unhappy that they were wives and mothers and not involved in the business of the colony or getting to vote or go to the town meetings? And my answer, and most historians believe, that women were generally happy, that they accepted the teaching of their religion, like most everybody else did, and that they understood that they had a special place in Puritanism as the homemaker, as the mother, as a wife, as a disciplinarian. And we have discussed that in the various lectures up until this point. Now, here is the biblical justification for keeping women out of power through St. Paul's edict to the Corinthians, where he said, "Let the women keep silent in the churches." We'll discuss Anne Hutchinson in a separate lecture concerning disorderly women, and we'll see how women who stepped outside of the bounds of normality, of motherhood, being a wife, would often be seen as outsiders, even in league with the devil, since they weren't fulfilling God's view of the world, that women were housebound mothers and wives. They were the devil's instrument, and that would, of course, lead to the witchcraft trials and accusations against independent women. But we'll get to Anne Hutchinson. But one of her criticisms by the leader of the Puritans, John Winthrop, was when she was told, "You have stepped out of your place. You have rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer." And that was a major put down for the time. So the Puritan belief was that a marriage brought these two parts of a soul together, the superior, which is masculine and eternal, and the feminine, inferior and moral. Both played their role. It's not just a negative to be feminine, because that brought the masculine part of the soul to earth, and it made it human. If you were simply masculine and internal, you would be not welcome really in this world, although it certainly was preference by the men that they were in control. Now, Quaker women, the ones that had settled in New Jersey, and William Penn of Pennsylvania was a Quaker and established Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony, which meant being open and free with everyone, including the Native Americans and women, accepted women as beings with souls, and women were equal to every other being with souls, which were men, the Native Americans, African Americans. Quakers were not supposed to hold slaves, although many did, and so the Quaker women could speak in the meeting house, their form of church. They could be leaders in the church, and we'll see a primary example with Mother Ann Lee of the Shakers, an offshoot of the Quaker religion. But they were treated with respect, and we'll find that many of the leaders, the outspoken, dominant women in society, were Quakers. And just a couple examples was Dolly Madison, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and if you don't know these names, you can either look them up now or wait till we get to them in our narrative of American history. Now, the Puritans come to America, and as we've discussed, the Pilgrims find cleared land. They believe God's cleared the space for them to settle. The Puritans believe they're building a city on the hill to be the prime example of what a Christian society can do. And so they had immediate success, although many people died in this process of settling the New World. But they were very fruitful. They grew, they multiplied. Colonies popped up all around. The initial Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, were all settled from this initial settlement around what is now Boston, and what the Puritans created as Boston. Well, by the 1650s, the relationship with the natives led to King Philip's War, and this shook the Puritans' confidence. This war lasted quite a long time. It was very bloody, and many colonists lost their lives, many more Native Americans did, and this shook the Puritan belief that they were still God's chosen people. In fact, it made them question whether they had slipped up somewhere along the way from their original founding of the colony to their present day during King Philip's War. So they had to look at their marriage, make sure that men and women were acting right, and the rules were strict on both. Violence was forbidden in the home. As we'll see, this was one of the few ways a marriage could end if there was proven that one of the spouses, and primarily in this case men, were violent in the home. Both men and women were punished for marital sins, sex outside of the marriage, but as you can imagine, women were punished much more severely. 16% of the convicted men were whipped, 53% of the convicted women were whipped. And just a note on that, Nathaniel Hawthorne in the 1850s would look back on his heritage. He was from Boston, and write the book, The Scarlet Letter, that gives you some indication on the marital morals or the sexual morals of Puritan New England, and certainly there are other sources as well. Conjugal rights in Puritan marriage. The Puritans were not puritanical in their belief that sex was a pleasure given by God, but they believed that this was strictly reserved for marriage for sex inside the marriage. And so a good sex life, a healthy sex life was very important. One of the leading ministers, Increase Mathers, would write about his sexual exploits. He wrote well over 40 books and hundreds of other article type things, and he would write about the joys of sex. Of course, he was married multiple times. His wives kept dying on him, otherwise he couldn't remarry or get divorced. But he is a good example of how the Puritans looked at sex as a very healthy, very important part of life. Now, sex outside the marriage destroyed God's view of society and would destroy the harmony created by good, strong marriages. But adultery, sex between married people, was the ultimate destructive force. This destroyed the community, while fornication, sex outside of marriage, would destroy people's morality. Sex between married people, adultery, would destroy not only those people, but their families and therefore society. Now, male and female adulterers were punished very differently. The male adulterers were seen as wronging their partner's husband, while the female adulterers had not only wronged their own husband, but also the wife, children, and the families, the relations of their partners. So, while both were punished severely, they were not treated as equal. That the woman's crime was much worse. And here's a depiction of the punishment of being locked in irons, and this would be in front of the church or in front of the town hall, and men and women would be put in there for days so that people could see and they could be marked with shame. They weren't kept there all night, that sort of thing, but the whole point of this was a public shaming of people who committed their wrongs against society. It was a societal crime. Now, divorce is strictly impossible in England until the 1850s. The southern colonies kept some English practices, but divorce was very restrictive because of the way society was created in the South. We'll see that in a few minutes. Now, the Puritans and Quakers saw divorce as necessary to the public harmony. They couldn't see keeping people married who had destroyed the principle of marriage by violence or by adultery. And so we'll see a couple of examples in just a second. Now, the marriage contract could be broken by men and women with given cause. The men's grounds for divorce were mostly that the wife committed adultery. And of course, since this was the crime against them and against society, most of these divorces would be granted. Now, women's grounds were a little bit more diverse. Bigamy, 44%. Impotence, 9%. And that testifies to the importance of sex in Puritan families, Puritan marriages. And desertion, 61%. And you can see that these equal more than 100%, but there were multiple causes in many of the divorces. What do you see about these reasons? Consider that, but they're mainly on the man's ability to take care of their family. If they were bigamous, they were divided between families, and so were not focused on the family that was seeking the divorce, the wife that was seeking the divorce. Impotence and desertion meant that they weren't living up to their husbandly duties. And so you can see the reasons that what women could get divorced were because of the man's failings, rather than they didn't get along, things like that. Now, there's some variation in the colonies, and usually when we talk about Massachusetts Bay, at this time we're talking about the New England area. Connecticut had separated from Massachusetts during the colonial era, and the divorces there were absolute, and this allowed for remarriage. And here the primary causes of divorce were adultery, husbands' claims against their wives only, desertion, fraudulent contract, the absence of a spouse for more than 7 years, and cruelty, as we've discussed before, breaking the marriage vows. In Pennsylvania, not strictly part of New England, but one of the middle colonies, the divorce was only for bed and board. You no longer had to live together, you no longer had to be a married couple, but marriage was eternal. Your souls were united, but you couldn't remarry. And here you have the causes for divorce being the same for men and women. Once again, it's a Quaker colony, and therefore men and women were treated roughly the same. The causes were adultery, bigamy, sodomy, and buggery. And there was no provision for absolute divorce, so no remarriage was possible. Now, one person that's prominent in history that this affected was the first son, the most famous founding father from Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin will be one of our case studies as we go along, but he had dated his wife and had fallen in love, and they were thinking about getting married when Benjamin got a job offer in England. So he goes off to England and doesn't communicate back with his wife or his girlfriend. He returns several years later, having actually gotten a woman pregnant. This would be the son William that they would raise, him and his wife. And his wife had gotten married, and so her marriage she could not get a divorce. Her husband had actually disappeared. They looked for him and they couldn't find him, but no remarriage was possible. So Benjamin and his wife started living together and became common law married. And there was never a legal marriage in the sense of church service or state sanction, but they lived as husband and wife for the next 50 years until his wife died in the 1760s, or right before that, in the late 1750s. Now in the South, you had a very different society being created. This was one of violence, of keeping African Americans under the servitude of bondage, with violence, with threats of violence. Also a very hierarchical society where the rich were in charge. There was a governor appointed by the king who was basically the all-powerful monarch of this colony. He certainly did not have that power once he was back in England. Then you had a king's council, an upper house of the legislature, and then the lower house, and you had a very tiered society. After that, you had the planters, who were the part of the upper house, and also the House of Burgesses, which was a representative body, and on down to the poor yeoman white farmers, who were just a step above all the African American slaves that were being held as labor. Well, women had very few rights in the Chesapeake, and they were far outnumbered by the men, but they were brought over usually as indentured servants. They would work mainly in the houses of rich planters, maybe in the fields, but they were treated a little bit better than men indentured servants. But once they got free, they could marry and have the rights of a free person. Now here you can see some advertisements for servants, men, women, and boys. Well, to begin with, in the Chesapeake, families were very fragile, and this was mainly because of the death rate. Extremely high death rate on into the 1650s and 60s, when it started getting a little better. Life expectancy was only 43 years old, a little bit lower for women until they would pass their childbearing years, because childbearing was very difficult. There was no real proper medical treatment. If you were having a cesarean birth, or what we would have as a cesarean birth these days, most of the time the mother would not survive. And any kind of breach, baby, or complications in childbirth would usually end the woman's life. And there was often cases where uteruses were torn and women would be confined to bed or confined to very low activity for the rest of their life after a pregnancy. Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife, died from complications in childbirth after, I think, about 7 or 8 pregnancies, and she had many miscarriages along the way. They only had 2 children survive young childhood, and 1 child reach adulthood. But the risks of death were extremely high. If you went to a wedding, most of the time, within 7 years, 1 or both of the participants in that wedding would be dead. And so as time goes on, you get more and more women. You have the men outnumbering women 3 to 1. A lot of child mortality, infant mortality. And so if you were able to have an heir and keep the land in your family, that was a very valuable thing. And some of the more prominent families that will see their heirs, the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the Randolphs, would trace back their lines into the 1600s. But not many people were back farther than that. Now, because of coverture, as we discussed in the background to colonial families, widows were prized. First of all, they were available women, which was a prize in and of itself, but they were often the most wealthy women or most wealthy people in the colonies, and they would often get their choice of men. Martha Washington, as one example, I was going to say doubled, but probably tripled George's prospects at the time of their marriage. She had been married to a man named Custis. They had 2 children, and the children had some interest in their father's land, but for the most part it passed to Martha, and on when she married George, on to him. And the 2 of them had no children, so basically George took care of Martha's children upon his death. But and Thomas Jefferson's wife, while she had not been previously married, he inherited much of his estate from her father. And many of the slaves that he accumulated over his lifetime were originally his wife's father's, including Sally Hemings, who would become his concubine, and they would have children together. And Sally's mother, who probably was the concubine of Jefferson's wife's father. His father-in-law probably had the similar relationship with Sally's mother as Thomas Jefferson had with Sally. Now, the marriages in the Chesapeake were usually informal. They were very quick. You have occasions where a widow would get married within a week or two of her husband's death. And the weddings and marriages in the South, it was very important to keep straight whose children were being born from these marriages. And so you have a stricter, more rigid marriage than you do even in the Chesapeake, even in the New England area. And so we have marital guides, marital manuals that were printed during the time, and these, for historians, indicate maybe a couple of different things for you guys to consider. First, that this was the prevailing wisdom, and it was simply to pass that wisdom on to newly married couples and newly married women so that they could know what their roles were. Second, people had been straying from these roles. People had been changing what marriage meant in Virginia and the Chesapeake region, and these guides were to get people back in line. So let's look at them with those two ideas in mind, that this proliferation of marriage manuals, and they may have been playing both roles or even a role that that I haven't considered here, but they emphasized how important marriage was. They defined the husband's role as to guide, to defend, and to provide for wife and family, while the wife's role was to serve in subjection to her husband's will, be modest in speech and dress, and to be a frugal and good housewife. Of course, the modest in speech and dress, at least I would interpret as trying to keep the women less attractive to a potential suitor, somebody who might encourage them to stray from their marital bed. Here's advice to Chesapeake wives from one of these sources. Never dispute with your husband, whatever be the occasion. And if any alteration or jars happen, don't separate the bed, whereby animosity will increase. By no means disclose his imperfections, or let the most intimate friend know your grievances. Otherwise, you expose yourself to be laughed at. Read often the marital service and overlook not the important word, obey. So you can see that marriages in Virginia were really strict, and in keeping with that, divorce was not an option except if a wife's life was literally in danger. And this was because the divorce would threaten the man's honor, it might weaken him in the sight of society and also in the sight of his slaves, and part of his keeping slaves in check, keeping slaves from rebelling, was that he was a powerful man, that he was a force to be reckoned with, that if you betrayed him, you would pay for your life. And so if a woman got the best of a man, it would seem to the slaves that he was weak and could be taken advantage of. And so you see Bertram Wyatt Brown writes that the problem was not just protection of women, but of male self-image and reputation before the world. Descriptions of husbands' sexual misbehaviors inevitably force men to consider the consequences to patriarchal authority should they take their wives' parts in such disputes. So, the conclusions of these ideas about marital family, of colonial families, all of the marriages were for the purpose of procreation, the idea of finding your life's partner and settling down for the joy of your own life and for your own fulfillment was not really a common idea. You do have strong marriages, you do have loving marriages, and we'll see one of those in full display with John and Abigail Adams. that they deeply and fervently loved each other. Much of what we've seen in Jefferson's writings with his wife, who unfortunately died right around the time of the Declaration of Independence, showed that he was devoutly and fervently in love with her as well. But the main purpose of these marriages were to secure land holdings, and to create heirs for those holdings. So in all the colonies, marriage answered the family as well as the individual concerns and had the social and economic significances. Now, in Puritan colonies, marriage was deemed a civil and not a religious institution, and the civil concerns for peace in the household and community prevailed. So if people strayed from their marriages, it would be a community problem, not an individual problem, thus the public shaming, and also the possibility of divorce and remarriage being allowed. And in the South, the idea of strong control of society by the men made divorce almost impossible. It also made keeping women's or white women's sexual sanctity pure very important as well. This was not the concern with the white men having sex with their black slaves. And as we've seen, the law was that if a slave woman had a child, that child would be a slave, just like the mother, even though the father would be white and probably part of the master's family, usually the master himself. So the male privilege in the South kept a strong hold on their slaves, on their women, and we'll see on children. Often the heirs would be very restricted in their control of property and even their life choices by their fathers, as long as their fathers lived. And this would also be a factor in the South, much more than it was in the North.